This is Tread Boldly, Leadership Lessons from the Saints with Father Nathan Cromly.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back with you. I'm glad to be back. I want to talk a little bit with everyone today about one of our favorite saints, Simon Peter, the first pope. And I say that because universally, when I go around preaching and talking with crowds, if I just said, what person in the New Testament do you feel the closest to? Almost everybody says the same thing, Simon Peter. It's almost like everybody just feels like it's good to be near a saint that makes mistakes, because most of us feel like we make mistakes and therefore can never be a saint. But you have St. Peter, the first pope, who was the prince of the apostles, the head of the apostolic 12, and he just found a way to kind of bumble his way through life. That's how it feels. And of course, it's not that way. But when you read the Bible, you can't help but be charmed by the many mistakes that Peter makes. Well, for example, in Matthew 15, Jesus gives this wonderful parable about the sower, which is really not that hard to understand. And Simon Peter asks him to explain. He literally doesn't get it. Or another time in Mark 10, where you have the children trying to come near Jesus, and guess who tries to keep the children away? Well, Simon Peter and the other apostles. That was a mistake. There's the time that's recounted both in Mark and Luke when Peter is sitting there arguing with other disciples about who's going to be the greatest. They were literally arguing with selfish ambition when our Lord himself would die on a cross. Then there's the most famous scene of all when he tries to walk on water only to sink because he looked at the wind and the waves instead of keeping his eyes on the Lord. In Matthew 16, when Jesus says he's going to save the world by dying on a cross, Peter literally tries to stop him. Once again, on the wrong side of the story here, Peter, and the list goes on. It's heartwarming for so many of us because he really earnestly tries to do what is right over and again, and he should get credit because at least he's trying. How many of the other apostles sat there and just kind of looked at each other? Well, Simon Peter steps forward and moves. It's just that in a charming kind of way, he was wrong about what he thought was right. And our Lord had to set him right when he found that he was wrong. And that's what's so beautiful about this whole story. Jesus doesn't seem to mind. It seems that Jesus actually uses Peter's mistakes to correct him, to teach him, and to make him even better. And I think this is such a lesson for us in our own sphere of leadership, because the thing that's going to hamper us more than anything else isn't the problems that we have on the outside. Having problems is not a problem. Having problems with having problems, that's the problem. The real question is, why are we so afraid of being wrong? It's almost like we would rather be silent and thought a fool than open our mouths and remove all doubt. And yet Simon Peter, on the contrary, he wasn't afraid of making mistakes. He did his best. He was more afraid, it seems, of not trying to be a leader, of not even though he was flawed, than he was of being flawed while he was trying. And Jesus builds on that. Remember that this same man who made so many mistakes while following Christ would one day lead the church and was the rock upon which Christ would build his church. And I think that's so important because Jesus wants to do the same with our lives. He wants to do great things with us, and we feel as if our inadequacies can get in the way. Well, yes, of course, they can in a human way, but God can write straight with crooked lines, and he can take even our inadequacies and turn them into the sources of his greatest gifts. If you remember what he says to St. Paul, for example, he says, "My strength is made perfect in your weakness." And therefore, St. Paul says, "I boast of my weakness, that the strength of Christ might be upon me." This is what's so beautiful about Christianity. It is a religion where the imperfect are made perfect by Christ, and where Jesus is the answer for our lives. And therefore, even if we don't have enough, Christ will suffice. What we have to do, though, is supply our courage, to not yield to the temptation, to be afraid and limit God's grace by our own fear. Trusting in Jesus, we need to then set out to dare what our hearts put in front of us, always prudently, always recognizing with humility what we cannot do, and yet at the same time trusting in God to make the most of our little offerings for his glory. Because Simon Peter didn't quit, we had a pope. And because we have a pope, we have a church. I think today we need to put aside our fears of failing and allow our faith to make us tread boldly wherever Christ calls us to go.
Oh, love it. Thank you so much. Father Nathan Cromly,